Hey everybody, welcome. So today is an exciting day because it's the beginning of a new literature unit, and we're going to take some time before we dive in to the new literature and talk about this idea of perspective. Perspective is going to be our common theme for everything that we explore together in this unit. It's going to be woven into all of our storylines. It's naturally already there in everything that we read, but it's an element that we're going to focus on as we draw connections between our own lives and the worlds that we encounter in this unit. So the big question that I want you to start to consider as we think about perspective is, what shapes your view of the world? Now that's a simple question, but it can have some really complex answers. So if something instantly popped into your head, a few ideas about the things that shape your view, that's great. But if you're feeling kind of stumped about that, that's okay too, because those are the exact types of things that we're going to discuss as we read and as we write throughout this unit. So let's start with the basics. Let's start with some definitions. So the word perspective can mean different things depending on which lens you're viewing it through. If you're an artist and you hear the word perspective, then you may think of the technique that's used to create the impression of height and width and depth, or a positioning in space within a piece of work. If you hear perspective and you're thinking about it from the geometric standpoint, or the way it would be used in a math class, then you might think of figures in the same plane and the theory that gives us two-dimensional and three-dimensional figures. And you may even know that it's this mathematical concept that the artist is using to create the illusion of depth within a painting. For the purposes of our literary discussions, the most accurate definition of perspective in that realm is of a particular attitude toward or a way of regarding something. And essentially, it's a point of view. Now, point of view is not a new term. It's one that we've used before. We've talked about it as a literary term. And perspective is really closely related, but it goes a little deeper. And so an understanding of point of view is going to be really important to the understanding of perspective, and that's why we're going to take a second to review. So our review term now is point of view. You'll remember that you can have first person, second person, or third person point of view. You could tack on a little asterisk and also include third person omniscient. And you know the difference between third person regular or limited and third person omniscient is that omniscient narrators know what every character is thinking. So in first person narration, you'll see pronouns like I, me, and we. You know that your narrator is experiencing the action firsthand. In second person narration, it's rarely used, but it will refer to the reader as you. And then in third person narration, we have an outside narrator who is referring to characters as he or she or they. Now again, as a review term, I hope that this is all coming back to you now. This has jogged your memory. If you struggle a bit with this term or you need some more explanation, you see that there is a YouTube clip here. It's a quick clip that you're welcome to review after this video. It will be connected as a resource. It gives a great example of how point of view is used in real life too as a sense of narration. It compares color commentary from a reporter that would be sort of up in a commentator's box above the action of a sporting event to a first-person view of a dashboard camera, for example, at like a NASCAR race. And the difference of perspective that you'll see of the exact same race, depending on if you're listening to the color commentary or viewing the race through that first-person dash cam. Let's take a look at our need to knows. We need a little bit more information about these big questions when it comes to perspective. We need to know how our perspective is shaped. How is it created? Where does it come from? We need to know how perspective affects what we believe and how we behave. And we also need to know how perspective is used in literature. So let's take a look at need to know number 1. How is our perspective shaped? So the values that we're taught, the things that we experience, the consequences that we experience to our actions, our cultural environment. These are not the only elements that affect our perspective and the way it starts to build, but they are some of the big ones. And as you can tell by this short list of 4, these are the things that shape who you are. And that's a big part of what perspective is. It's the way that you view the world. And these are the types of things that influence that. So could you think of something else that we could add to our list that would naturally affect the way that a person sees the world around them, their perspective on their surroundings? Need to know number 2, how does your perspective then affect your behaviors and your beliefs? So you will act differently and you will act accordingly to what you believe about the world. So the inferences that you make about people or places or the actions of other people, those are going to be based on your perspective. So if an inference is sort of an educated guess that you make about which people are trustworthy, which people are, quote, good or bad, your education for your educated guess comes from your perspective and comes from those things that you're taught as you grow up. Our view of what's right and what's wrong, again, depending on the environment in which you're raised and the experiences that you've had, one action could appear right to some and wrong to others, or there could be a lot more wiggle room depending on who you ask. You may have someone whose perspective is very black and white. You may have someone who recognizes a little bit more of a gray area. And then finally, our views of what's normal. You may know that when you're younger, you may be able to relate to the fact that when you're sort of in the bubble of your own family or your own surroundings, you kind of think that the way that you do things is the way that everyone does things. That's normal. But as you get older and you're more social and you spend more time at other people's houses or discussing some of the elements of your home life, you may start to see that what you always thought was normal is normal to you but not others. Or that what you thought was maybe what the majority of the way people lived or conducted themselves, actually that ends up to not be true. Doesn't make it better, doesn't make it worse, but it does affect our behaviors and our beliefs based on that perspective. Need to know number 3, so how does all of this come together and how is perspective used in literature? So perspective is used in literature to create depth in our characters. If we as real people all have a perspective, our characters and the perspective that they have within a story, it's going to make them more relatable, more realistic. Perspective is used to engage us in the plot. So depending on whose point of view we're seeing the story from, who's narrating for us, perspective can be used to create suspense, to create conflict. It can be used as a literary device in a lot of different ways. Perspective can be used to reveal theme and also to build relationships with the narrators, between the reader and the narrator. Sometimes it's a strong relationship, one where you can trust what the narrator is saying. Sometimes it is revealed to you through different perspectives that you have an untrustworthy narrator, that you start to believe that you may be missing pieces of the story based on who is telling you the story. So this information leads us to some essential questions, and these are going to be the big ones that we come back to every time we start a new story, every time we approach a new piece of writing within this unit. And the first is, how does perspective shape reality? And the second is there a difference between reality and truth? So those are big questions. And again, if you don't have instant answers, it's not a problem. But if you did have an instinctual response, especially to that second question, is there a difference between reality and truth? If you immediately said, yeah, there's a difference, or your first thought was, no, those are synonyms, stop for a second and do know that there's someone else in the class who had the exact opposite but just as strong reaction to that question, and start to consider the other side of that coin. It's going to be an interesting point of discussion and something that we're going to be able to pinpoint and analyze within each of the stories that we read as part of this unit. That wraps up our introduction to perspective as a literary technique. I really look forward to exploring this concept within this unit and hearing all of your ideas and feedback along the way.